Thank you very much. It's really kind of you to give us some of your time today from Dubai. CLIL is something which I've discovered only recently. And my first question after the 20 years of teaching English as a second language is, what are the benefits, the specific benefits of CLIL?
You know, in the 1990s, in the 1980s, I was working in Borneo, in a country called Brunei, which is located next to Malaysia. Both of those countries were looking at ways of improving the learning of English. And what they opted for was to have half the days teaching in English and half the days teaching in Malay. And they did this by actually recruiting mainly British teachers to teach through English. And they thought it would be a very, very successful way of improving learning levels of English overall. But it wasn't successful because it became a sort of a school within a school. Half the day was in Malay, and that was taught in a certain way, and half the day was in English, and that was taught in another way. And I think the children became a bit confused. Then I moved to Europe, and in the 1990s, Europe had another problem, different to the one they have now, or some of the ones they have now. And that problem was that with the integration of all these countries, the language learning levels were simply not high enough for the children who were studying various second languages. And at that time, when you looked at the data and you looked at the number of hours that children in Spain, Italy, France were learning English, really the overall outcomes at the end of the day were very poor. So in 1992, the European Commission set up a specific department called, which was called Lingua, had actually been set up a little earlier, to investigate, are there ways of accelerating language learning in the world which could be introduced in Europe. And a group of people were brought together from different countries, including Spain. And they worked for a year. I was one of them. And we looked at all these different ways of language teaching, content-based language teaching, immersion, you know, quality communicative language learning, and so on. And we said, you know, there are schools in the world where children learn languages very quickly. And there are commonalities between these different approaches, even if they have like different names. And at that time, we decided that none of the terms that were available were really suitable to describe these methodologies. We didn't want to go out there and create a new term. I don't think any of the team wanted to accelerate their careers by becoming, you know, associated with yet another new fad in English language teaching or in language teaching. But the term CLIL seemed to be one which could adequately describe this new kind of methodology. So CLIL was born, and I think it was successful from the very beginning because it introduced a more natural environment for a young person to learn the language. And I'll explain that during the course of this interview.
Right, an interesting thing I read yesterday in a paper that CLIL is an umbrella term and it covers a multitude of approaches. Could you give me some idea of what is CLIL and what definitely isn't CLIL?
CLIL has become very fashionable in the last 10 years, and publishers and others have sort of jumped on this bandwagon of using the term to promote their interests, sell their books, and so forth. And what CLIL is not is simply changing the language of instruction without providing a suitable methodology. You know, in Malaysia, in Brunei, which I just mentioned, they changed the language of instruction, but they did not introduce a language supportive methodology. CLIL is the language supportive methodology. And I think that's the easiest way to answer your question. We could talk maybe about what's happening in some countries in the world in a while. But CLIL is not simply standing up in a school in Madrid and teaching geography as you would teach it in Spanish. It's not. It's very unlikely that it would be anything like that. Yeah.
Okay, so you said that you could tell us a little about how CLIL is being developed and used around the world.
In my work here, I work as an advisor on how to transform educational systems quickly. Education is a very, very slow, I don't know what you call it, a tortoise, if you like, compared to a fox or a cheetah right across the world. It's very hard to really innovate in education. And what we did not know in the early 1990s when we started looking at CLIL was how closely aligned it is to modern education. I'll give you an example. Here are some basics of what you will find in CLIL. You will find a holistic education, right? You don't just go into the lesson to learn the English words and the English grammar and to do communicative exercises that are not somehow real. You go into the class and you learn something which touches your emotions and touches your interests. And in a way, you take your eye off the language. I'm here to learn language. And you put your eye on to how can I explain why water evaporates? And the language learning becomes somehow naturalistic if the language support is there. If the language support is not there, then it will not work. Let me try and give you an example. I've got a glass of water here. Can you see this glass of water? Okay. Let's imagine we have three students, Millie, Molly, and Mandy. Okay. This represents a language sort of immersion lesson. Okay. Now Millie would learn. Millie would be able to learn Spanish even if she didn't have a teacher. She's just a natural born. Here's Millie. She's just a natural born language learner, and she just will dive into that Spanish immersion environment. She'll turn up in Madrid, and within a month, she'll be able to complete really quite basic communicative activities. Molly's a bit different. Molly is slightly different, and she will struggle, right? She will struggle. And then you have Mandy. Now, Mandy is probably typical of 50 or 60% of the students that we have in real schools, okay, in government schools in different countries in the world. And Mandy, unfortunately, will sink in an immersion environment. She'll sink, she'll get lost, she'll become demotivated, and she'll say to herself, you know, I'm not actually very good at learning languages. This is an example of how the immersion technique is used in a way where some kids, they learn languages just so naturally, and some don't. The real development of CLIL was to provide an experience as rich as immersion for a very broad range of children, so that the Mollys and the Mandys would also be successful in learning. And I think basically, when you look at the quality factors of what's happening here, competence-based learning, teaching whilst doing, is a key success component of modern teaching and of CLIL. Giving students autonomy and responsibility for their own learning and firing them up is again to do with good education and to do with CLIL. Having students teach each other, giving them space to teach each other, learning through collaboration is common to good forms of CLIL. Giving them actually tasks which do stretch their imagination, which make them creative and which make them problem solving is the fourth. And then emphasizing that this learning experience is that the children are learning how to learn. You know, in CLIL, they use the English, they learn the language, and at the same time as learning how to use the language in a very interesting way. So the results of this approach are actually very exciting for that broad range of young people that we need to give much better language skills to in our schools and in our countries.
So in terms of teacher training, do you think at the moment in teacher training programs there's enough importance given to CLIL, or do you think there's a lot of work still to do to make people more aware of the advantages of the CLIL approach?
CLIL threatens the English language teaching industry. Okay? And I could see this happening right from the beginning, because the English language teaching industry, or profession if you like, has been full of fashions which have come and gone and come and gone. You and I have probably been in this business for a long time. We've seen it. We've seen terms come in and we're thinking, you know, everybody's talking about this now, but what is it really? And surely we're doing it already, and so on. I think that the real issue here is that this is modern education. This is actually an education which suits the new generation we have in our schools. It suits the need for our future young adults to be able to be competent in actually handling themselves in an internet-savvy world. And it suits the interests of the teachers, who actually for a long time have been wondering, how can I make this hour or these 10 hours that I have with my students really productive for all of them? Yeah. So I think it is emerging as a very relevant and exciting way of teaching. And the teacher training has been very slow. Now, I mentioned that education can be slow to change in some countries. That's an understatement, actually. But universities are very slow to change in some countries. And sometimes people do not like changing the way things are, the status quo, okay? And CLIL does mean changing the status quo. So traditional teacher education really needs to bite the apple big time in order to incorporate this kind of methodology. It is happening, it's beginning to happen now, but it's been very, very slow in the making. And normally what's happened is that practicing teachers have picked up books or gone on courses and tried to start doing CLIL in one way or another. There is a free publication called the European Framework for CLIL Teacher Education, which was produced in 2010. You can find it on the internet. It's actually housed in a place in Graz. It was produced by the Council of Europe. That might be a nice read for wanting to know more about teacher education. In-service teachers who have taught for more than about 10,000 hours, so people who are a little bit older than in their 20s, they probably need 30 or 40 hours of reading, studying, practicing in order to become quite competent as CLIL teachers. When we talk about training, we always think that it's a matter of speaking English. Always thinking that if I'm going to teach my environmental sciences program in English, I must speak English as well as Prince Charles or Princess Anne or something. And that is absolutely not the case. Speaking English well is absolutely very, very important. Of course it is. But the methodology that we use in a CLIL project or a CLIL program is actually more important. It's actually more important because what we need to do is to give the youngsters an appetite for, gosh, English is relevant, gosh, English is fun, and gosh, I'm actually quite enjoying myself doing this.